The calm before the storm. The early morning sun painted the sky in hues of orange and gold as it peeked over the horizon. Riverside Park stretched wide, a green oasis in the middle of the bustling city. Birds chirped, joggers pounded the pavement, and the rhythmic creaking of swings filled the air as children played without a care in the world. Among them was a young boy, no older than 10, his laughter ringing out as he sprinted across the grass. His name was Malik Thompson, a bright and curious kid with deep brown skin and tight curls bouncing as he ran. In his hands, he clutched a toy airplane, lifting it high and making whooshing noises as he ran. His mother, Ayana, sat on a nearby bench, smiling as she watched her son play. "Stay where I can see you, baby," she called out. "I will, Mama," Malik yelled back before taking off toward the large oak tree at the center of the park. A few feet away, Officer Ethan Reynolds surveyed the scene with an air of quiet authority. His police canine, a hulking German shepherd named Duke, sat obediently at his feet, his ears perked as he followed his handler's gaze. Reynolds had been patrolling the park for years, and to him, it was nothing more than a routine part of his job. But today, something gnawed at him. His sharp eyes landed on Malik. Something about the carefree way the boy ran, the way he occupied the space so freely, rubbed him the wrong way. He watched as the child weaved between park benches, his sneakers kicking up dust from the worn-out patches of grass. The officer's fingers tightened around Duke's leash. He had never liked how certain people acted like this was their city, their park. The way some of them strutted around like they belonged anywhere they pleased. He told himself he was just keeping an eye on things, that his unease was justified. And then Malik tripped. The boy fell forward, his toy plane slipping from his grasp as he landed hard on the ground. It was nothing serious, just a scraped knee and a startled gasp, but Reynolds saw an opportunity. He took a step forward, his voice cold and authoritative. "Hey, kid," he barked. Malik looked up, his dark eyes wide as he brushed dirt from his hands. "You shouldn't be running around like that," Reynolds continued, his tone sharper than necessary. "You're gonna cause trouble." Malik hesitated. "I was just playing." "Yeah," Reynolds scoffed. "This ain't a playground. Get up and move along." Ayana, who had been chatting with a friend, noticed the commotion and immediately rushed over. "Excuse me, officer, is there a problem?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. Reynolds barely spared her a glance. "Your boy needs to be more careful. He's running all over the place like he owns it." Ayana's eyes narrowed. "This is a public park. He's just a kid." Reynolds smirked. Sure. Just keep him in check." Malik shuffled closer to his mother, gripping the hem of her shirt. Ayana could feel his little heart hammering against her side. Reynolds, however, wasn't done. "Actually," he said, tilting his head, "I don't think he gets it." Duke, sensing the shift in his handler's stance, let out a low growl. Ayana's stomach clenched. "What are you trying to say, officer?" "I'm saying, maybe he needs a little lesson in listening to authority." Before she could react, Reynolds made a sharp gesture with his hand. "Duke, heel." The dog responded instantly, standing up and bristling as he took a step forward. Malik froze, his eyes darting between the massive dog and the officer who controlled him. Ayana's heart pounded in her chest. "Call him off," she demanded, stepping protectively in front of her son. Reynolds smirked. "Maybe if the boy apologizes for causing a scene." Malik's small fingers clutched at his mother's shirt. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You don't talk back to a cop, kid," Reynolds sneered. By now, a few parkgoers had stopped to watch. Some whispered among themselves, uneasy but unwilling to step in. Others turned away, pretending not to see. Reynolds nodded toward Duke. "One little scare ought to teach him." With that, he uttered the command, "Duke, bite." For a split second, the world seemed to slow. The German shepherd tensed, muscles coiling like a loaded spring. And then, "Stand down," The voice boomed across the park, deep and filled with authority that could not be ignored. Reynolds turned, startled. A tall man in a dark blue uniform strode toward them, his broad shoulders squared and his badge gleaming in the morning sun. His brown skin glowed with a natural sheen of authority, and his face was set in a mask of cold fury. Captain David Thompson, a police captain, and Malik's father. Every head in the park turned toward the approaching figure. Reynolds' face drained of color as recognition hit him like a sledgehammer. Duke, still mid-movement, hesitated. He had been trained to obey commands, but even he sensed the shift in power. His ears flattened slightly as he whined, confused by the sudden shift in tone. Captain Thompson wasted no time. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice like steel, "what do you think you're doing?" Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. "I said, what do you think you're doing?" Captain Thompson repeated, his tone deadly calm. Malik, still clutching his mother, whispered, "Daddy." Thompson barely spared a glance at his son, though his heart ached at the fear in Malik's eyes. Right now, there was only one thing on his mind: justice. Reynolds swallowed hard. "Captain, you were about to sick a police K-9 on a child." Thompson's voice was deceptively quiet, but every syllable dripped with restrained rage. Reynolds' hands clenched at his sides. The kid was causing a disturbance. "A disturbance," Thompson repeated, his eyes flashing. "My son was playing in the park, and you decided to terrorize him." I didn't know." "You didn't know he was my son, did you?" Thompson cut him off. "Because if you did, you never would have dared. But that's the problem, isn't it? You thought you could get away with it." Reynolds opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Thompson turned to Duke, who was still frozen mid-command. "Go back to your post," he ordered firmly. The dog immediately relaxed, retreating a few steps and sitting down. Thompson then turned his piercing gaze back to Reynolds. "You're done." Reynolds blinked. "Sir, you're done." The air was thick with tension. For the first time, Reynolds realized just how many people were watching. Phones were out, cameras rolling. The truth was no longer just in the park. It was being recorded, shared, and spread like wildfire. And Captain Thompson, he wasn't letting this go. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fire within. The silence in the park was deafening. The onlookers stood frozen, unsure whether to step in or step away. Parents clutched their children closer, sensing the tension thickening in the air. The only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves, the rhythmic chirping of birds, and the quiet, shuddering breaths of Malik, who was still gripping his mother's hand. Captain David Thompson stood tall, his gaze locked on Officer Reynolds. His badge, polished and gleaming in the sun, carried the weight of his authority, but it was the fire in his eyes that truly commanded the moment. "I want your badge," Thompson said, his voice unwavering. Reynolds' face darkened. "Sir, with all due respect." "Respect?" Thompson's laugh was humorless. "You just ordered an attack on a child. My child. And you want to talk about respect?" His voice was sharp as a blade, cutting through the quiet. The people around them stirred, murmuring, shifting uneasily. A few had already started recording, their cameras capturing every second, ensuring that what had just happened would not be forgotten. Reynolds squared his shoulders, trying to regain some sense of authority. "Captain, there was a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding." Thompson cut in, stepping closer, his towering presence forcing Reynolds to slightly retreat. "I saw everything. I saw the way you looked at my son, the way you tried to intimidate him. I saw you abuse the badge you wear, the uniform that is meant to protect, not terrorize." Reynolds clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. "You think this is over?" Thompson continued, his voice dangerously low. "You think you can walk away from this without consequences?" His words were laced with a quiet, simmering rage, the kind that didn't explode in a flash of fury, but rather burned slow and deep, unyielding. Then suddenly, a new voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" Another officer had arrived. His uniform crisp, his presence authoritative. Sergeant Lucas Carter, a veteran of the force, known for his level-headedness. He walked up, eyes flicking between Thompson, Reynolds, and the trembling Malik, who clung to his mother like a lifeline. "Yeah, there's a problem," Thompson said, barely sparing him a glance. "This officer just tried to set a K9 on my son." Carter's face flickered with surprise, but he remained neutral. "That true, Reynolds?" Reynolds exhaled sharply. The kid was running wild. "I was just trying to." "Trying to what?" Thompson cut in again. "Teach him a lesson. Show him who's in charge." Carter's expression hardened as realization dawned. "You gave a bite command." Reynolds hesitated. "Answer him," Thompson demanded. Reynolds swallowed. "Yes, but—" "Jesus Christ," Carter muttered under his breath. He turned back to Thompson, his voice tight. "Captain, I'll handle this. We'll take it to the station. File a report." "A report?" Thompson scoffed. "No, this isn't going to be another filed incident that disappears. I want action. Right now." Carter nodded, turning to Reynolds. "Hand over your badge and gun." Reynolds stiffened. "You're seriously?" "You heard me," Carter said firmly. "Hand them over." For a long, tense moment, Reynolds just stood there, nostrils flaring. Then, with a reluctant movement, he unclipped his badge, placing it in Carter's outstretched hand. His service weapon followed. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. But Thompson wasn't done. "I want a full investigation," he said, turning to Carter. "And I want him off the force." "Captain, let's not." Thompson stepped forward, his presence nearly overwhelming. "Do you know how many times this happens? Do you know how many fathers don't get to step in, don't get to stop this before it goes too far?" His voice cracked slightly, but he held firm. "This isn't just about my son. It's about every black boy who's been made to feel like they don't belong, like their existence is a problem to be dealt with." Carter nodded solemnly. "I hear you, Captain. I do." He turned to Reynolds. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Reynolds' face was red with anger and humiliation. He looked around, saw the cameras, the expectant eyes, and he knew there was nothing he could do. "This is bullshit," he muttered. "No," Thompson said, finally stepping back. "This is justice." Reynolds shot one last glare at Malik before storming off. Thompson exhaled, his anger still simmering. He turned to his son, kneeling down so they were eye level. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Malik's eyes were still wet, his small body trembling. "You okay?" The boy hesitated before nodding. Thompson pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him close, feeling his tiny heart racing against his chest. He stroked his son's hair, whispering assurances, promising that no one would ever hurt him. Ayanna placed a gentle hand on Thompson's back. "Thank you," she whispered. But Thompson knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. And he was ready for the fight ahead. The fight for justice. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The murmuring crowd had slowly begun to disperse, but the eyes of those who remained flickered with both shock and quiet anticipation. Phones were still recording, their lenses capturing the moment, ensuring that the truth would not fade into silence. Captain David Thompson remained crouched beside his son, feeling the tiny tremors still racking Malik's small frame. His wife, Ayanna, was rubbing their son's back, her own hands shaking from the aftershock of fear. But fear had no place here anymore. Not after what Officer Reynolds had tried to do. Thompson stood slowly, his eyes sharp as steel as he turned to Sergeant Carter. "I want his entire record pulled," he said. Carter shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, I understand you're upset. But what?" Thompson interrupted, stepping forward, his towering frame nearly overshadowing the sergeant. "How many complaints has he had before today? How many warnings, how many times has he abused his authority? Because I guarantee this isn't the first time. Carter exhaled through his nose, clearly struggling with the weight of the moment. He knew Captain Thompson wasn't just any officer. His name carried weight in the department. He was respected. And most importantly, he was right. "I'll look into it," Carter finally said. "I'll pull his record, see what's there." "See what's there?" Ayanna snapped, her voice sharp with barely contained rage. "You mean to tell me you don't already know? That a man who would set a dog on a child doesn't have a history of this?" Carter had no answer to that. And Thompson knew the truth. "I want him fired," he said simply. "Not suspended. Not reassigned. Fired." Carter hesitated. "You know as well as I do," Thompson continued, his voice low and firm, "that if I hadn't been here, if this had been any other boy, this would have ended differently. And no one would have done a damn thing about it." Carter swallowed hard. He looked around, saw the lingering crowd, the phone still recording, and realized this moment was bigger than him, bigger than the department. "I'll do what I can," he said. Thompson's jaw clenched. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The system at work. Later that evening, Thompson sat in his office at police headquarters, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his desk. The dim glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows across the room. But his mind was far from the stillness of the night. He had spent hours reviewing reports, digging through files, looking for every complaint ever filed against Officer Ethan Reynolds. And what he found made his blood boil. 7 previous complaints. 7 different cases of excessive force, intimidation tactics, and unwarranted aggression, and every single one of them dismissed. Insufficient evidence. Failure to corroborate claims. No disciplinary action necessary. It was a pattern, one Thompson had seen too many times before. Officers like Reynolds didn't get fired. They got warnings, slaps on the wrist, quiet transfers. Until one day, they went too far. Thompson leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers against his temples. He wasn't just a father demanding justice. He was a man who had spent years fighting for accountability in the system. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that the system protected its own. But this time, it wouldn't. Not if he had anything to do with it. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. He frowned but answered. Thompson speaking. A low, measured voice filled the line. "Captain, we need to talk." Lines being drawn. The next morning, Thompson arrived at the precinct to find the atmosphere unusually tense. Officers stood in small clusters, whispering amongst themselves, their eyes darting toward him as he passed. He wasn't surprised. News of what had happened in the park had already spread like wildfire, not just among civilians, but within the department itself. And not everyone was happy about it. "Captain," a voice called from behind. He turned to find Lieutenant Mason Hughes, one of the senior officers, striding toward him. Mason was a well-respected officer, but there was something in his posture today, something stiff, unreadable. "We need to talk," Mason said, his voice low. Thompson didn't flinch. "I'm listening." Mason sighed, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Word is, the union's not happy about this." Thompson arched a brow. "The union's not happy?" He let out a bitter chuckle. A child was nearly mauled by a police dog, and they're worried about their reputation. "You know how this works, Dave," Mason said, using the familiarity of his first name as an attempt to ease the tension. "Reynolds has been on the force for years. They're gonna fight to keep him. If you push too hard, they'll push back." Thompson folded his arms. "Let them." Mason exhaled. "Look, man, I get it. What happened was messed up. But if you go after him like this, you're going to start a war." Thompson's eyes were cold and unwavering. "Then let's start a war." A flicker of something, respect, hesitation, maybe even fear, passed through Mason's eyes. "Just be careful," Mason finally said. "There are people who don't want things to change." Thompson nodded once, understanding the unspoken warning. He already knew that. He just didn't care. The pressure mounts. By the afternoon, the press had gotten wind of the incident. Headlines flashed across screens. Police officer orders K9 to attack child. Caught on camera. Justice or cover-up. The fight for police accountability continues. When protectors become predators, the disturbing reality of policing in America. Social media exploded with outrage. The footage from the park had gone viral, fueling debates, arguments, and demands for action. And the department was feeling the heat. By late evening, Thompson received an email. Subject: Internal Investigation Inquiry. Officer Ethan Reynolds. The message was clear. The department was officially launching an internal review, but Thompson wasn't naive. He knew how these things worked. They would stall, delay, hope that public outrage faded before they had to act. Which meant he had to move faster. Ayanna sat beside him at home that night, watching the news coverage. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're not going to stop, are you?" she asked. Thompson met her gaze. "Not until there's justice." She nodded. "Then neither will I." And together, they prepared for the battle ahead. This wasn't just about Malik. It was about every child, every family, every person who had ever been made to feel powerless. And Captain David Thompson wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. A system under fire. The following morning, Captain David Thompson arrived at police headquarters to find the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. The moment he stepped through the front doors, conversations hushed, eyes flickered in his direction, and a few officers even turned their backs. He wasn't surprised. The story of what had happened in the park was now national news. Footage of Officer Ethan Reynolds ordering his K9 to attack Malik had spread across social media like wildfire, igniting debates on policing, racial profiling, and abuse of power. The department was scrambling to contain the damage, but it was too late. The truth was out. The real question now was, would the system do what it always did, protect its own? Or would this finally be the moment justice prevailed? Thompson strode through the hallways, his mind focused, his mission clear. He wasn't here to play politics. He was here to take down a man who had no business wearing a badge. The moment he reached his office, his phone buzzed. "You've got visitors," his assistant, Jenna, informed him. Thompson sighed. "Who?" "Union reps. And Chief Reynolds." His hands curled into fists. Chief Reynolds. The father of Officer Ethan Reynolds. The room felt suddenly colder. "Send them in," he said. "The showdown begins." A few minutes later, the office door swung open, and in walked Chief Samuel Reynolds, a veteran of the force, a man whose reputation loomed over the department like a shadow. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, his uniform pristine, but his expression was hard as stone. Behind him were two representatives from the police union, both men in sharp suits, carrying briefcases that screamed legal backup. Thompson remained seated, refusing to stand for their arrival. This was his office, his battlefield. Chief Reynolds sat down across from him, his pale blue eyes locking onto Thompson's. "You're making a mistake," he said without preamble. Thompson leaned back. "No, your son made a mistake, and now he's going to face the consequences." A flicker of something, rage, perhaps, passed through the chief's eyes, but his voice remained calm. "Ethan is a decorated officer," Reynolds said. "He's served this department with distinction for over 10 years, and now, because of one incident, Thompson cut in sharply. "Your son has 7 previous complaints of excessive force. 7. And I'm willing to bet there are even more that never made it to a report." The chief's jaw tightened. "He's been cleared of all those complaints," one of the union reps interjected smoothly. There was no formal disciplinary action. Thompson let out a bitter laugh. "Because the system is designed to protect officers like him. Officers who abuse their power. Officers who think they can get away with anything because they know the right people." "You're out of line," "Captain," the second rep said. "No," Thompson said coolly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Chief Reynolds folded his hands together. "What do you want?" "I want your son off the force," Thompson said bluntly. "Fired. No pension. No quiet reassignment. No second chances. He's done." The chief exhaled, shaking his head. "You know that's not going to happen." Thompson stared at him. "Then I'll take it to the press." The room went deathly silent. "You think this department can survive the public knowing that an officer with 7 complaints was allowed to keep his job after attempting to sick a dog on a child? You think I won't use every connection I have to make sure this doesn't get buried?" The second union rep shifted uncomfortably. "Let's not escalate things, Captain." Thompson's voice was ice. "You're right. Let's not. So fire him." Chief Reynolds' face was unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he leaned forward. "I can't just fire him outright." Thompson arched a brow. "You could if you wanted to. But fine. What's your offer?" "A quiet resignation," Reynolds said. "He leaves the force. No pension, no benefits. But no official termination." Thompson considered this. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. "And," he pressed. Reynolds exhaled sharply. "An internal investigation into K-9 unit policies, changes in training protocols, new de-escalation rules." Thompson nodded slowly. "I want public transparency. I want those investigations open to civilian oversight." Reynolds scowled. "That's a reach." "You need to give the public something," Thompson said, "or this fire will keep spreading." Another long silence. Then Reynolds sighed. "Fine." Thompson smirked slightly. "Looks like we have a deal." The aftermath. By the next morning, the official statement was released. Officer Ethan Reynolds resigns amid controversy. The department spun it, of course. They called it a mutual agreement, a difficult but necessary decision. But the truth was clear. He was gone. And the public, they weren't satisfied yet. The fight wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that had let him exist in the first place. The demands for reform grew louder. Protests erupted across the city. People weren't just angry, they were demanding change. And Captain David Thompson wasn't done fighting. That evening, as he sat with Ayanna and Malik at the dinner table, he watched his son laugh, his innocence slowly returning. He reached over and ruffled Malik's curls. "You know I'll always protect you, right?" he said softly. Malik nodded, his small fingers gripping his father's hand. "Yeah, Daddy. I know." But Thompson also knew. This wasn't just about protecting his own son. This was about every child who deserved to live without fear. And he wasn't stopping until justice was truly served. The war beyond one battle. The resignation of Officer Ethan Reynolds was a victory, but Captain David Thompson knew it wasn't enough. It was a mere drop in an ocean of systemic problems that ran deep within law enforcement. The day after the department released its statement, the media frenzy only grew. News outlets debated whether Reynolds' resignation was justice or a mere attempt to placate the public. Community activists called for deeper investigations, demanding an overhaul of policing tactics, particularly the use of K-9 units. The police union, unsurprisingly, was working behind closed doors to contain the damage. Thompson watched it all unfold from his office, a fresh stack of documents in front of him. Every piece of paper detailed misconduct cases involving K-9 units across multiple precincts. Reynolds wasn't an isolated incident. He was part of a pattern. A system that had been designed to shield bad officers while punishing those who dared to speak out. And Thompson wasn't done exposing it. The press conference. 2 days later, Thompson stood behind a podium in front of City Hall. The crowd before him was massive. Reporters, activists, concerned citizens, and fellow officers who were tired of the status quo. His wife, Ayanna, stood in the front row, her hand resting on Malik's shoulder. Thompson adjusted the microphone, and scanned the sea of faces. Then, with steady resolve, he spoke. As many of you know, Officer Ethan Reynolds has resigned from the force. While this is a step toward accountability, it is nowhere near enough. It does not erase the fear my son felt when a man sworn to protect chose to abuse his power. It does not erase the 7 complaints against Reynolds that were swept under the rug. It does not erase the reality that officers like him have been allowed to operate without consequence for years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed, and reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Thompson continued, "I am here today, not just as a captain in this department, but as a father. As a man who has served this city with integrity. And I am telling you all, this is not just about one officer. This is about a culture that protects the wrong people and punishes those who demand accountability." He placed his hands firmly on the podium. "I am calling for an independent civilian oversight board to investigate police misconduct cases." The crowd stirred. "I am calling for mandatory public access to all disciplinary records of officers found guilty of excessive force." A few voices cheered. "And I am calling for an end to the use of K-9 units in crowd control and nonviolent situations." The reaction was immediate. Some people applauded, others gasped. Reporters threw out questions all at once. "Captain, do you expect pushback from the department? Are you suggesting that K-9 units be completely dismantled? What does this mean for ongoing investigations into Reynolds and other officers?" Thompson raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I expect pushback. I expect resistance, but I also expect change, and I will not stop until I see it happen." The department's retaliation. By the time Thompson returned to his office, the backlash had already begun. A letter from Internal Affairs sat waiting on his desk. He picked it up and read the first few lines. "Effective immediately, Captain David Thompson is placed under review for violating departmental conduct policies regarding public statements and media engagement." A slow, humorless smile formed on his lips. So this was their move. Punish him for speaking out. Make an example of him. He exhaled and placed the letter down. He had expected this. In fact, he had prepared for it. His phone buzzed. It was Mason Hughes, the lieutenant who had warned him earlier. Thompson answered. "You've got a target on your back," Mason said without preamble. Thompson chuckled. "I've had one for years. What else is new?" "They're talking about reassignment," Mason warned. "Sending you somewhere quiet. Somewhere you can't make noise." Thompson clenched his jaw. "Let them try." "David," Mason's voice was quieter now, "they're not just going to let you walk away from this. You're making enemies in high places." "I don't care," Thompson said. "You should," Mason countered, "because they play dirty. The threats begin." That night, Ayanna found Thompson sitting on their porch, staring out at the quiet street. She sat beside him, their shoulders brushing. "You're worried," she said softly. He let out a breath. "Not for me. For you. For Malik." She placed a hand over his. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." He nodded. "Yeah. But they're already coming after me." He gestured toward his phone, where an anonymous message had come through earlier. "You have a family, Thompson. Stop pushing before you regret it." Ayanna's grip on his hand tightened. "You think it's real?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not backing down." She exhaled, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then neither am I." They sat in silence for a long time. Then Malik appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Daddy?" Thompson turned. "Yeah, buddy." "Are the bad guys gone yet?" Thompson felt a lump in his throat. He stood up, walked over, and picked his son up in his arms. "Not yet," he said honestly, "but they will be. The next battle." The next morning, Thompson walked into the precinct knowing full well that he was walking into a storm. He was immediately met with whispers, sideways glances, and more than a few outright glares. Officers who had once respected him now saw him as a threat. Others, the ones who had always wanted change, nodded at him with silent support. But the biggest surprise came when he walked into his office. Sitting across from his desk was City Councilwoman Andrea Vasquez, a fierce advocate for police reform. "I heard your speech," she said, standing as he entered. "It takes guts to go up against your own department." Thompson smirked. "I've been told I have a bad habit of pissing people off." She chuckled. "Good, because I need someone like that on my side." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For the next step," she said. "I want you to help lead the city's new Civilian Oversight Committee." Thompson froze. "That committee doesn't exist yet." "It will," she said confidently, "if we fight hard enough. And I need someone who knows the system, someone who's lived it, to make sure it actually means something." Thompson studied her. This was bigger than just Reynolds, bigger than just him. This was the fight of his life, and he was ready. "All right," he said, extending his hand. "Let's get to work."